Today we're going to be looking at how to add tables to a website with HTML5. The objectives of this lecture are going to be learning when to use a table in an HTML element, the basic HTML5 table elements needed to create a table on a page, other HTML5 elements to make the table more accessible, adding the accessibility attributes to the elements, adding table attributes to merge cells, adding the fig elements for accessibility purposes, and finally adding styles through CSS. Today we are going to look at adding tables to an existing website. In HTML5, tables are used commonly to communicate information, not for page design as it was in the past. With that said, let's look at a few examples of when you would add a table to an HTML web page. You would add it for pricing information, store hours, donation tables, sports schedules, activity schedules, school course schedules. These are just a few examples of what tables can be used for. The list for using tables can go on and on. Let's take a look at how to place a table in an HTML document. First, you need to know which HTML elements to use and what they are used for. The very first one is the table element. The table element defines the table itself so that the browser knows where the table will be placed on the page. The table element by itself does not display anything, but rather holds all the other elements that make up the table. The next one we're going to look at is table row. The table row element defines and displays a table row and is one of the elements that are nested between the open and close of the table element. The third one we're going to look at is the table heading. The TH element is nested inside a pair of table row elements and creates a cell in a column in a row and contains header information about the table. By default, the table header cell is boldface and is centered in the cell. And the last one we're going to look at is the table data element. The table data element is also nested inside of the table row element and can contain data for the table display as a single cell in a row. By default, the table data in this cell, though, is aligned to the left with plain text. The next thing we're going to look at is accessibility elements for a table. The table header element, which is different than the table heading element, groups one or more rows creating a header. To create the table header, you simply code the rows that make up the header between the open and closed tags of the T-head element. The table body element defines the information of the table to be conveyed to the visitor as the body of the table. To create the table body element, you simply code the rows that make up the body in between the open and closed tag of the T-body element. The last one we're going to look at is the table footer element. The table footer element groups one or more rows together to create the footer for the table. When you create the table footer area, you would do it the same way as you would with the table header or the body. Why is this important? Why should you care? Tables without structural markup to differentiate the proper T-links between the header and the data cells create accessibility barriers. Relying on visual cues alone is not sufficient to create an accessible table. With structural markup, the header, the data cells, and the footer can be programmatically determined by software, which means that people using screen readers can have the row and the column headers read aloud as they navigate through the table. Screen readers speak one cell at a time and reference the associated header cells so the reader doesn't lose content. Some people use alternative ways to render data, for example by using custom style sheets to display header cell more prominently. Techniques like this enable them to change text size and color and display the information as listed rather than in grids. In order to allow alternative renderers, table code needs to be properly structured. structured, and by using the T-head, T-body, and T-footer accessibility elements, it will provide an alternative for people using such technology to understand they're looking at information in a table. Other accessibility attributes for tables. Because tables are difficult for visually impaired users to decipher, HTML provides a few other attributes that can improve accessibility. These attributes can be read by screen readers. One of them, which is not actually an attribute, it's actually a tag or an element called caption. The caption element tag provides a summary of what the table is used for and should be used under the table heading element. The next one is a true attribute. It's the headers attribute. It is applied to the TD or the TH element and is used to identify one or more header cell that the cell is associated with. The last one is the scope attribute. The scope attribute is applied to the TD or TH element and is used to indicate whether a cell is associated with a column, a row, or a group of merged cells in a column. Sometimes you'll need to merge columns and rows to create large space in a table. This can be accomplished by using the attributes col span and row span. Once you figure out how you want your table to look, you can then apply these attributes. Col span uses an attribute col span equal the number of columns that you want merged together to create this kind of effect. As you can see on the screen, the top row, which is a TH for table heading row, has been merged together, creating a col span that spans 5 columns. The code you would use is displayed at the bottom. The next one is row span. Row span uses the attribute row span equals the number of rows to be merged. As you can see here, the second row merges 3 rows together to create the large box on the left. The code that would be used is TD row span equals 3, indicating that it's to go 3 down. These two attributes can be used in the HTML elements TH or TD only. As a result, you may want to remove the correlating numbers of tables. These two attributes can be used in the elements TH or TD. As a result, you may want to remove the correlating number of table heading elements or table data elements from the table row while you're coding. You'll see an example of that shortly. Using the fig elements. The figure element, which we've seen in earlier chapters, can be used as a container to hold the table to display it as a figure. The figure capture element is an inline element and not a block element, and can be changed using CSS to make it a block element, but will describe the figure with a caption either above or below it, depending on where it's placed in the page. The last thing we're going to look at is CSS for tables. To add styles to your tables, you'll want to use CSS. CSS can be applied to the table, to TR, to the TH, and to the TD elements. You can also apply CSS properties you have been exposed to in earlier chapters to tables. The most common properties for formatting the tables, table rows, table headings, and table data cells are the border collapse. The border collapse is a keyword that determines whether white space exists between the borders or adjacent cells, or two the borders are collapsed to create a single border around the cell instead of having double or multiple borders or double or multiple spaces. The next one is border spacing. Border spacing can be either relative or absolute value that specifies the space between cells when the borders aren't collapsed. The third one we're going to look at is padding, the space between the cell containing the outer edge of the cell. So if I look at the example on the screen right now, the word padding, all that space to the right of it is considered padding. Text alignment. You have 2 different ways that you can align text in a cell. With text alignment, you can align it horizontally. And then with vertical alignment, you can align it vertically. So that is it for tables. Let's go build some tables.